Good evening, comrades and friends. I want to say a little bit about Venezuela, but in a certain context, the historical context of the struggle for revolutionary internationalism. We have reason to believe that it's necessary and extremely current, not just because of the crisis that Venezuela is in, but because of the entire global situation. I think I mentioned last week in some, off-the-cuff remarks that 10 years ago, Hugo Chavez and those closest to him tried to organize a meeting that they hoped might usher in a Fifth Socialist International. And indeed, in Caracas, in late 2009, they had a meeting. I'm not sure who attended that meeting from the U.S. It may not have been many people, if anyone at all. There were representatives from 30 countries, 50 parties. It's safe to say that most of the parties were probably in Latin America, but there was representation from around the world. They were not able to achieve, the maximum goal of that meeting for reasons that are too complex to get into now. Suffice to say, perhaps it was premature, but it was a hell of a thing for Hugo Chavez to even try that. There were many motives for it, from what little I read. That was on the heels of the '08 crash of the financial markets, the near-death experience for capitalism, and that highlighted the fact that the system was going downhill and on its way to death, and the need to, ramp up the struggle against capitalism. That was one thing. Another thing was that Hugo Chavez believed, and it's credible, arguably, that at that time he perhaps was, one of the very few people, very few leaders that had the credibility to even do that had the stature to do that. One should add that this is the first time that a serious call, a call that we could take serious, for building a socialist international came from someone and someplace outside of Europe. And that's historic in and of itself. But there was a very practical and immediate motive. Hugo Chavez, just as Maduro, just as any of those who are in the leadership of liberation movements and in the ranks, know that at any time their revolutionary project may face a imperialist war of one type or another, whether it's economic, whether it's sanctions, whether it's starvation, whether it's military, on and on and on, sabotage, covert. And in such instances, who do we rely on? Is our success completely up to us? Of course it is. That's decisive. That's fundamental. One of the things that we've learned from history is that no one, no matter what their intentions are, how good or revolutionary their intentions can be, can direct somebody else's struggle from outside their country. On the other hand, is it completely up to a movement, to a party? What responsibility do we have who may be thousands of miles away? A lot, we think. That's called internationalism. Should a revolutionary process, be based on, oil dropping, or whether it goes up? Should it, be based on whether this or that leader makes a mistake? Perhaps. These are very, controversial questions, and they've been argued, and they're certainly argued about, the movement in Venezuela. But what's our responsibility? Here it's 10 years later, 10 years after Hugo Chavez floated this idea of a new socialist international. And I would argue that the need to be thinking about such a thing is 1,000 times more urgent today, because it is so clear that all of our struggles are both separate, that has to be respected, but they're also interdependent. The world is smaller. What does globalization mean? Globalization means that capitalism on a global basis is far more integrated than it has ever been in its existence. That also means that our struggles are far more interdependent than they have ever been in the history of the struggle for liberation, the class struggle, the struggle for socialism, and revolution. Revolutionaries have to be thinking anew about this. The imperialists certainly are globalists, so shouldn't we have caught on? You know, we've got local struggles are extremely important. Certainly don't want to polemize against that, but now is the time, if there's any backsliding in this, to understand concretely, practically, how interdependent our struggles are all over the world. There's also this, which makes it perhaps not the worst time for our comrades and friends in Venezuela to again be tested. There's a worldwide struggle against capitalism. It's still in an incipient stage, but capitalism has never been more unpopular. There's a worldwide struggle against the rich, with all of the contradictions. Even those people over in France putting on yellow vests, that's a march against, that's a movement against the rich. The education workers who are rising up, that's part of a rebellion against the rich. The fact that Democratic Party presidential candidates have to hesitantly, begrudgingly, reversibly, believe me, endorse or suggest taxing the rich, that's because they feel the heat from below. There is a growing global revolt against the rich, and this bodes well, at least it should, for our solidarity with Venezuela. If there was ever a time for the slogan, "There are no borders in the workers' struggle," now is the time for it. But it just has to become more than a slogan. We have to find a way, as quickly as we can, to make that practical and actually decisive. And it can be. We would argue at the moment, and this is not to take anything away from any struggle, that's not necessary, that the struggle to defend the Bolivarian Revolution is the defining struggle at this moment. Because what is it? It's many things, but it's a 20-year rebellion against the rich that imperialism wants to crush. There are those in the movement who may not like the fact that that defending Venezuela is the defining struggle at this moment, not just for the Venezuelans or the people in Latin and Central America, but on a global basis. They may not like it because it may be inconvenient, because they may be influenced by all the right-wing propaganda against Venezuela, and they want it to be some other thing. They may be tied up in trying to see if they can elect a progressive president, or if they can really make the Democratic Party left or push it to the left. And at the appropriate time, we'll talk about this, comrades. But there's a lot of energy, and you know what? We could talk about that later. But right now, defending Venezuela is more important than that stuff. It was always and will always be more important than that stuff. But right now, if you really want to fight for socialism, if you really want to get a good idea of what a real revolutionary struggle is, where there's odds and where there's heavy stakes, and you're fighting imperialism and the prospect of military intervention, get involved in this struggle. Many new people in the movement, and people who are not so new, must again be reminded, especially in the wake of all of this right-wing propaganda, You heard it against Zimbabwe, against Libya. Every time an oppressed people try to take control of their destiny, it is akin to a slave revolt. And those who think they are the rulers of this world forever cannot allow that, and they will do anything to crush it. They are still wringing their hands and criticizing each other in the Pentagon and on Wall Street for allowing Cuba to live. They wonder, how did we miss that? What happened? Whose fault is it? You know? And in the wake of that, they've decided that no other revolution, and what they consider to be their backyard, they think that, you know, where Venezuela is, they own that. We own that oil. We own those people. They can't do that. Shoot them down. Bomb them. Whatever has to be done. Not so easy. They can't get away with it. Finally, comrades, February 23rd will mark the 1-month anniversary of this infamous attempt at a coup. That's a few weeks from now, I believe. A few weeks in a day or two. We are part of a number of organizations that have decided to make that 1-month anniversary a day for the world. And this is not as against or in competition with all of the other wonderful activities that have taken place and that are taking place. But we feel that this is a good opportunity that everyone can grasp, to come out everywhere, globally, to defend the Bolivarian revolution and to make a material difference in the rebellion against the rich, which the defense of this revolution is integral to. And we're calling on everybody, first and foremost, those groups, many of them right here in this room, that already agree. But even amongst the activists, some of them young, some of them not, who are in motion politically. You know, some of them are in the Democratic Socialists of America. Some of them are in other organizations. You know, some of them believe that they can do something with the Democratic Party. We don't hold that belief. Move with us. By the way, in moving with us, don't criticize the revolution. Don't make demands. Don't ask them to negotiate. Don't dictate to them what they should do. Believe me, they're in a better position to know that. If you want to tell them what to do, you should join the United Nations or the State Department, or, you know, but if you really want to be helpful, you know, just do what you can where you are to defend them. We put out an excellent statement. By now, I think all of you are familiar. Not just us, there's a statement being circulated. We're getting more and more signers, you know, and two of the most important things about that statement, it's got a lot of good things about it, but in my opinion, is one, the position that those of us who are trying to defend the Bolivarian revolution should not be calling for negotiations or any other thing like that. That's not for us to do. And number two, and I haven't seen this in other places, maybe I just haven't looked hard enough, we call for Wall Street making reparations for all their crimes against Venezuela and the oppressed people and people in liberation movements and the working class in the world. You know, that's righteous and revolutionary. So February 23rd, comrades, see what you can do with that date. We would like to inspire and encourage actions of every shape, form, and size on every continent. But naturally, those of us here in the belly of the beast, where the ruling class poses the greatest threat, the real heavy lifting, the real responsibility rests on our shoulders. So let's try to make this going forward. Not that we haven't tried before, but you know, this is a new year and a new world crisis. Let's make this a revolutionary example of how forces, even forces with differences, forces with different histories, you know, can come together and demonstrate that whatever things divide us, We understand that the world has entered a new phase of its development, and while it's fraught with dangers, it's also full of revolutionary potential. And we want to push that envelope to see what victories we can make. Long live the Bolivarian Revolution. Long live the rebirth of revolutionary internationalism starting now. The struggle to defend the Bolivarian Revolution, has to be seen first and foremost in the context of the struggle against colonialism and neocolonialism and for self-determination. And President Maduro was correct, and it should be expected that he's very strong on that, and that's righteous. It's up to some of us to view it in an even larger context, especially now, to make it a global struggle. That context is good, but it's also a global struggle. And if there was a way that we could, through our propaganda, through our own, outreach, to get as many of those who hate capitalism and who hate the rich to understand that Venezuela is not some separate issue, but it's part of that. It's part. You're rising up against the rich. You should defend the revolution. See, can we generalize it where geography is not necessarily decisive in terms of support? That's one thing. There's this too. Those in the capitalist class who are paid to think. It's a unique milieu, because a lot of the capitalists, especially the richest ones, they don't think. They just try to get money. They don't think beyond tomorrow. If they can rob you and kill you and hang you and get everything you got, they're not worried about next week. They're not worried about the fact that they're going to destroy the planet. And, comrades, word up, we might have to have the revolution a lot sooner than some of you are planning. Otherwise, we'll all be trying to get on another planet, that's viable. No, but there's a certain milieu of capitalists who are paid to think, whether it's about the capitalist economy, whether it's about the military, whether it's about politics, and they are, essing bees, because you got that, huh? You got that, because they were all in Davos, I think that just ended. And it was a gloom and doom over there. Oh my God. U.S. imperialism is getting weaker. They're not able to lead anybody. We don't understand the president. All the things that we built up since the end of the imperialist war, second imperialist war, where U.S. came out on top. Those institutions are falling apart. And now, this country, they're in a recession, and there's no end to it. And we can't, lower interest rates because they're already too low. We don't have any money to give them because all the central banks have already given up too much money. And, there's some next step. The next shoe is dropping in the worldwide capitalist crisis, a very bad one compared to 2008. And we don't have any ammunition to fight it with. And we don't know what the catalyst will be. We don't know whether it'll be trying to raise interest rates. They scared the Federal Reserve. They're not going to do that for a while. We don't know whether it's going to be Brexit. I think there's a deadline, the end of March. We don't know whether Italy or Spain are going to default, or some bank's going to fall, or some city, like Detroit's going to declare bankruptcy, or the political crisis, which basically the bourgeoisie has gotten away with in terms of the economy. It's even gotten boring a little bit, talking about, the bullshit about Russia and impeachment. But now that the global economy is much weaker and vulnerable and fragile, political events can have an impact that they perhaps would not have 6 months ago or even a year ago. The trade war with China, that they're all watching it. They market it. It's like a central nervous system. It doesn't necessarily reflect what's going on in the system, but it reflects where people's heads are at, because something happens and they buy, another thing happens and they sell. Venezuela could be a sleeper catalyst for, I'm not predicting it, but sometimes the catalyst for a deepening crisis comes from the place where it was least expected. And because of the state of the world, the magnitude of the crisis that we're describing, if the Venezuelans hold out, they've got a lot of support. They've got support from countries. That's very important. Of course, Cuba, there's a huge link. A number of other governments, Mexico, I think Bolivia, but and most importantly on a global scale, China and Russia. I don't, who knows where all this will go. It's somewhat unpredictable. That's why, in our mind, even if we can't make it like instant tea, we have to have a vision of forming another superpower, the workers and the oppressed of the world, So while it's great that governments, it's great that the Venezuelan revolution can depend on the support of governments in the neighborhood and around the world. But one day, these processes should be able to depend on another superpower, and that's the people of the planet, organized on a higher political level. But that's gonna take a while. But back to the point I was trying to make, if this struggle it definitely entered a new phase in the struggle to crush the Venezuelan revolution. It's going to be protracted. I mean, Maduro could have meant many things, but when he said this, this is going to be worse than Vietnam, that's what he was trying. You do this, you go ahead, go ahead, you do this. You think it's going to be quick? You think it's going to be over quick? No. You're going to set this continent on fire. And the world is very small, and that fire is liable to spread. So, among other things, don't rule out this new development in Venezuela actually developing into something that the mood in the world amongst the masses actually, takes advantage of in a progressive, if not revolutionary way. Not a prediction, a possibility.